Okay. And,
thank you, Tracy.
oh, Tracy, what would we do without you? And I think I got a memo now on my screen to say we're being recorded, so everybody will know. So I want to welcome everybody, to those of the nearby community and those who are much farther away geographically, as well as members and friends of MacNeill. And my name is Heather Hobbs, most people know that who are there right now, and I am a member and deacon at MacNeill. This series has been planned by the MacNeill Christian Education Board with the following planning group: Lynn Bond, Tracy Carr, Bev Leslie, Mary Fleming, Rebecca Eisbrenner, and myself. Now, I'm just going to go through the Zoom protocol, and please feel free to interrupt if it's not clear, because I'm certainly not a tech person. But here we go. Before the introductions proper, it is important to review this protocol. We are on Zoom right now, as you know. The session is being recorded and will be posted on the MacNeill website for the benefit of those who can't be online tonight. All attendees will be muted during the presentation, and well, there's a bit of debate about that. It's sometimes beneficial to turn off your own video during the actual presentation by the guest speaker. Apparently it helps the bandwidth, but I'll just leave that to you. And Bev can alert us if there's a problem. If you wish not to be identified in the recording, we invite you to change your Zoom name to something other than your given name and to remain off video if you ask questions live. Our speaker tonight will make her presentation uninterrupted, leaving the questions and answer session until she is finished. Now, there are two options for asking questions. You can enter any question in the chat box as the presentation goes along, or you can ask your question directly at the end of the presentation by signaling, by waving, or just speaking. Now, anything should be added to that, you tech gurus? Okay, so just a bit of background before we turn it over. Some years ago, like many churches and community groups, the Congregation of MacNeill devised a land acknowledgement in recognition of the history of Indigenous peoples on our land. It goes like this: MacNeill Baptist Church acknowledges the traditional territory upon which we gather as a community of faith. For many thousands of years, the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples were the caretakers of this land. We seek a new relationship with the original peoples of this land, one based in peace, friendship, and respect. Acknowledging territory is a beginning and not an ending in terms of our work towards truth and reconciliation. We hope that this acknowledgement will be a springboard towards a deeper relationship with all Indigenous peoples we meet. And so, we are hoping that this series is a step forward in listening more, learning more, knowing more, and doing more. Just a couple of words about the next two sessions in the series. The second session will take place on a Thursday. Note that, I know it's choir night in Canada, but MacNeill choir rehearsal had already been cancelled weeks ago. So Thursday, May the 11th, from 7 to 9, and it's going to be in person at MacNeill. The co-facilitators are Dr. Karen Hill, Mohawk physician from Six Nations on the Grand, with Denise McQueen, a Mohawk educator from Six Nations on the Grand. And this will be very much an experiential lesson for us all. We are going to be involved in an Indigenous circle process. So that's in person. The final session will be on Wednesday, May the 31st from 7 to 8:30, also in person at MacNeill, entitled How Then Shall We Live? And Tracy Carr, settler committed to the journey of truth and reconciliation with Indigenous people, will be our guest speaker. Now, Tracy's here tonight, and I'm just about to introduce her. I'm going to turn it over to Tracy to introduce our guest speaker. As mentioned, she will facilitate the third session in this series. Tracy is a friend of the congregation. MacNeill members will recall her moving tribute to Ginny Cale at Ginny's memorial service held last August. Tracy has been a strong and helpful part of this planning group. So I turn it over to you, Tracy, with many thanks.
Thank you, Heather. And I'm so honored to introduce our guest speaker this evening. So Dr. Amy Montour is an Oneida woman from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. She received her Bachelor of Science in Nursing, Masters of Science in Nursing, Doctor of Medicine degrees from McMaster University, as well as completed her family medicine residency at McMaster. Amy works clinically as a palliative care physician and a family physician for the elderly. She is also a hospitalist and the co-lead of the Division of Indigenous Medicine at Brent Community Healthcare System. Amy's personal journey to this point has been remarkable, something that she shared with the Hamilton Spectator for an article in 2018. And you can find that article easily if you do a Google search of Amy's name, which will also reveal the many other awards and recognitions that Amy has received. I encourage you to read them all. While these achievements are notable, what really drives Amy is in what she does is her deep commitment to Indigenous people and to healing. She is courageous in pursuing this purpose, often stepping into colonial institutions of health and education at great personal cost. It was in one such institution that I met Amy, and I'm forever indebted to her for her patient and persistent, helping me to see, to learn, and to unlearn. As a person who desires to have a loving and positive impact in the world, it has been a challenge for me to see and accept the truth that the colonial forces that committed Indigenous genocide thrive in me unconsciously, unless I am aware of them and I consciously act to mitigate them. I've been so blessed to have Amy as my teacher and also as my friend. I am grateful that Amy, without hesitation, agreed to be the first speaker in this series, and I can say with confidence that if you are here with an open heart and humble and ready to receive truth, what you hear tonight will continue to move in you, to inform you, even transform you over the coming weeks and years. So thank you for choosing to be here. And finally, because Amy has always emphasized to me that relationship is at the foundation of everything that we do together, to help strengthen a sense of personal connection with Amy, I'll share that she is a strong and devoted mother and wife, a proud and loving grandma, and given the audience tonight, I'll also share that she's the daughter of a Baptist pastor. So welcome, Amy, and thank you for giving of your time, energy, and wisdom this evening. Can't wait to hear what you have to share.
Well, thank you again for allowing me this opportunity. Every situation that I step into is a learning experience for myself as well. So when one of my favorite things that my dad likes to do when he's preaching is to use little stories to illustrate. And one of the things is he says, when you're pointing fingers at people, remember all the rest of the fingers are pointing back at you. So he always reminds us when he's preaching that he's preaching to himself as well. So I want everybody to know tonight that this is a safe space, that you can ask questions, that you can ask questions you may feel are silly, or maybe you feel a little bit of angst in asking the questions, because I am a safe person to ask those questions to. And I believe that, this is the work that God has given me to do. And so I'm going to share my screen now. And throughout this, I'm going to talk about history, and I'm going to interweave it with my own personal stories. So I hope it has meaning for you as well. Okay. Okay. So I've just taken the title from the title of your session, and I've put up this piece of artwork here because one of the things that struck me, one of the people that I learned from is actually an Indigenous artist that Tracy and I both know, Lori Gallant. And one of the things that struck me in her teaching methods is how she uses art. And I like to put this picture up because when non-Indigenous people or non-Haudenosaunee people, which is my nation, see this picture, you can enjoy it for the beauty of it, for the artistic talent that is displayed in it. But there is so much more to it that if you're not from my culture, you might not understand. The beauty of my people, of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, our laws, our beliefs about our relationships with the Creator and ourselves and each other and all of nature are all encapsulated in this picture. It's our political system, it's our belief system, it's our history all in one picture. And it's amazing to me that it's like a hidden truth. It's like a hidden mystery that I have. And that's what I want to share with you today, the things that I've learned along the way. So just for a little bit of roadmap, I guess, I'd like to talk to you tonight about the ancient knowledge base of my people and the historical and political context that removed the knowledge base of my people from modern society, and how we together, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, can come together and use Indigenous methodology to advance truth and reconciliation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical context. And I often do talks like this in healthcare, in all sectors of our nation. And sometimes people will say to me, oh, do we have to talk about the history again? And yeah, we do. And the reason why is this. We have to think about it in the same way that we think about remembering our veterans. If we don't talk about the Great Wars, we forget the sacrifices that those men and women did for us. We forget the lessons that we learned from those wars. And so when we talk about the history of Indigenous people within Canada, it's not to point fingers, it's not to blame and shame. It's just so that we can all get on the same page, so that we all have the same understanding. Because for most of us who are over the age of 40, when we went to school, the history that we were taught about Canada and the formation of Canada was a perspective that was only from one segment of our population. It didn't include the Indigenous perspective. And what is happening in schools today is the Indigenous perspective is being included. So in 40 years, I fully expect that I won't have to go back and tell anybody about the history. But for now, we still have to understand how the history impacts us today. And I'm hoping that I can connect the dots for you. Oh, before I move on, I just wanted to tell you what this picture is. So the Haudenosaunee people lived in longhouses. Our whole society was based around longhouses. We had a very complex society, and this is an artist's rendering of what a small Indigenous Haudenosaunee village would look like probably in the 1400s. The main longhouse would have been sort of where we conducted our business, and all of that happened there. And all the other longhouses were family-owned longhouses. And in my particular nation, the Haudenosaunee nations, we were matriarchal. So each one of those small family longhouses would represent a matriarchal line of people. And so that is before contact, where me and my people would have lived. Now, our people, commonly known, we call them the Americas, but our people, as far as we can remember through our oral history, have always called this landmass Turtle Island. And for a long time, even as an Indigenous person, I didn't know why we called it Turtle Island. And then one day I seen an artist's rendering of Turtle Island, which you can see there on the right side of your screen. And it kind of blew me away a little bit, because I thought, how did Indigenous people that, over 1,000 years ago understand what this landmass could represent in terms of resembling an animal from a view from space? Because that's the only way that you could really understand how the Americas could be shaped into Turtle Island. So I still can't explain how my people knew this thousands of years ago, but they did. They understood that this landmass known as the Americas now looked like a turtle, and it was called Turtle Island. Now that does relate back into the creation stories, and I'm not going to get into that. But our oral history on this continent, mainstream scholars have looked at how long our oral history has went back, and the only date they can come up to is about 1142 AD. However, pieces of our oral history go back much further than that. And if you pay attention to some of the more recent archaeological finds in the Americas, you will find that even the archaeological record is being changed. Whereas there were a lot of theories about how Indigenous people came to this landmass. Those theories are being challenged and revised as we speak, because what we thought we knew about Indigenous people populating this landmass is only a fraction of what actually the truth is. So this part of our history, our shared history, how the Americas ever became populated, and then how non-Indigenous people came here, is still a work in progress. We still don't know all the answers. And when I talk about this with my father, because he's a great mentor of mine, he just tells me, maybe one day God will reveal it, but even if he doesn't, we just have to trust that he knows what's going on, and he'll reveal it in his time. So if we think about what this land looked like from my people's perspective, this is a map of my people's territory with our own languages on it. This is the territory, the natural territory that my people would have existed in. We did go a little bit further west and a little bit further south, but this was our main territory. And if you look on the side where I have a picture of the dish with one spoon wampum, this is an ancient agreement, initially between my people and the Anishinaabe people. So the Anishinaabe people have come east from the ocean down the St. Lawrence and really sort of northeast of where we are today in Hamilton. And we overlap territories. There were also other people in this territory. Some of the Hurons had migrated this way, the Wendat, and other miscellaneous nations that had migrated along the way. Why did we share this territory, this beautiful territory of New York and Ontario and even parts of Quebec? Well, because it was a bountiful territory. Even today, even with all of our urban expansion that has went on, Southern Ontario is still just absolutely beautiful with all of our natural resources that we have here. But prior to contact, this place was like McDonald's for Indigenous people. Like we came here and this is where the good food was, the good berries were here, the animals were plenty, a ton of fresh, clean water. It was easily navigable area for all of our Indigenous people to get to and to migrate in the summer and to migrate in during hunting seasons. Well, as you can imagine, not all nations got along. We're just human beings, and with all the fallacies of every other human, and so we had wars and we had fights. And before my people became known as the Haudenosaunee, we all fought amongst each other. And there is a story that's called The Peacemaker, and it's a story of a Huron man who was given a divine revelation that he was to take the story of peace from the Creator to Indigenous nations. Now, it's not unlike the story of when people were at Pentecost and they were sent out to all nations to preach the story of Jesus Christ. It's not a dissimilar story to that. This indigenous man was given a divine revelation. How he got that revelation, I don't know, but he was given it. And he traveled to my people and he gave the story of peace. And through that story of peace, my people came together first as 5 nations, and then later on as 6 nations. And we're now known as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We learned to live with each other, but then we had to learn to live with the Anishinaabe because we were overlapping territory with them as well. So we created an agreement, a peace agreement between our nations and the allied nations on both sides that was called the Dish with One Spoon. And it's a very simple teaching. We are going to share this land. And in our culture, beaver soup was a delicacy. And so the bowl in the middle is to represent beaver soup. It's the best of what we have. And we are going to share it because we need to share it. We need this, none of this land belongs to any of us. And when we come to share this land, we're going to care for it. We're going to take only what we need. We're not going to be wasteful. And we're going to leave the land as it was before we came. And so it was a shared agreement about how we would share resources and how we would care for the bountiful resources that we had. And that was pre-contact, how my people lived. We had knowledge. We were there, you know, in the 1900s, there was a narrative, especially in the early 1900s, the indigenous people were savages. And what that conveys is that we didn't have a complex political and social system. We didn't have a way to sustain ourselves. And I always challenge people on that idea because even archaeologists will tell us that we've been here for at least a couple of thousand years. So how did indigenous people in the millions populate the Americas? And yet when newcomers from the European nations came, this land was pristine. Well, it may seem that we lived in a very simple way, in a very savage way, but what we did was live in balance with nature. We weren't uneducated, we weren't unintelligent people. We lived in balance with nature and we were able to sustain the Americas in a pristine manner for thousands of years. So clearly we had knowledge. And what that knowledge was and is has been the subject of a lot of research amongst Indigenous scholars. And we sort of defined a little bit of what that knowledge looks like. Some of it is personal. And when I stand here before or sit here before you today, I'm not an expert. My personal knowledge is a collection of ancestral knowledge, of my colleagues' knowledge, of observations of the natural world, of divine knowledge given to me through my relationship with God. It's all of that, and that's my personal knowledge. The ancestral knowledge that I have, some of that is orally transmitted because we didn't have a written language, but we had an oral history and we had wampum. We were able to perpetuate our stories. And it's not something that is less than established written languages. It isn't. Our people were trained from a very young age to be accurate, to recount the stories in a way that made sense. But what did change was the context in which the stories were told. So the meaning of the story never changed, but perhaps the context did to better fit the day and the age in which the story was told. It was also experiential. Our people had no technology. We lived off the land. Although we had homes, longhouses, most of our day was outside, observing and learning from creation around us. And the Bible itself tells us that we are without excuse because we can just look around in the natural world and understand what God has done for us, what God has created for us. So God gave us the ability to get knowledge from observation. And we still do that today, even in the Western world. Our research is based on observation, and a lot of that on the natural world. And it's holistic. And that's where it becomes harder for non-Indigenous people to understand our knowledge. Oftentimes, if you go in and sit with an Indigenous elder, you may ask a question, and an hour later they've been talking, but they have never directly answered your question. And even for myself as an Indigenous person, sometimes I'll sit there and I'll think, well, I asked a question, but I'm not sure I got an answer. But it's the way that they tell us. It's not a directive, what kind of way, like thou must do this. Here's a story. Ponder it, meditate on it, think about it, sit with it. And then you will have what in the Christian faith we would think of as a divine revelation about what that's supposed to mean to you. And it's narrative. We told stories. Everything in our world is about stories. If you're teaching a child something, it's in stories. You use humor and even some teasing, but it's always in a story, and that's a way of teaching. And we know that Jesus Christ himself used stories. He used parables. And so we're not that different. It's not this completely different paradigm. The way we describe it, the way we speak about it, it may be different, but we have commonalities, because I like to tell people that we are all Indigenous from somewhere. Each one of you on this call, you have an Indigenous roots from somewhere. It's important to know what your Indigenous roots are, who you are. Because when you know yourself and you know where you came from and you know where your knowledge came from, you can start to understand and appreciate differences in a way that is not threatening, because you're grounded in who you are as well. And this is an example of the holistic and the joining together of our physical and spiritual way of thinking about things. So a lot of times when we talk about ceremony in Indigenous culture, we feel a little bit timid about it, because there was a misunderstanding when European newcomers came here. It looked like something very different than churches from Europe. Churches in Europe had been established. There was Anglican, there was United, there was Presbyterian, very established sort of protocols for what religious worship looked like. And we were not in that sort of category where things were established, written down, and there were protocols. Everything was connected to everything else. So, for instance, strawberries. We have something called strawberry ceremony in our culture, and it is a woman's medicine. Well, if you dig into sort of the physical piece of it, it's high in vitamin C. There are nurturing things that can help a woman to ease into womanhood and to deal with all of the physical states that a female body will feel. But it has more than that, because of the strawberry also has spiritual teachings for us, forgiveness and peace. And so when a woman goes through a strawberry ceremony, her first strawberry ceremony, it is initiation into womanhood. So it's a social ceremony. It's a spiritual ceremony, because they're given teachings of forgiveness and peace that they're supposed to carry forward in their roles, their female roles that will be given to them in our culture. And it's also a physical rejuvenation for the woman. There are actual physical benefits from consuming the strawberries. And so everything is wrapped up to one. But when our ancestors first met, and there was established religious European leaders in those newcomers, it was so foreign to them that it felt like it had to be not from God. It had to be savage. It had to be perhaps witchcraft. And so that was the narrative that was carried forward. Ceremony in Indigenous communities went underground, and we're just now starting to bring them back to the forefront, because we realized that there's no shame in the spirituality in which we preserve our social, our health, and our family systems. We have lots of sources of Indigenous knowledge. We have traditional knowledge, and that is carried in our oral history. It records our connection to the land. It is our land acknowledgement, is that traditional knowledge. That's how we know where we're from and who we are. We also have empirical knowledge, those repeated observations over time from living with the land and living in balance. And we pass that down through our oral history as well. And then we have revealed knowledge. And this is something that Christians can understand, because Christians have revealed knowledge as well. You know, have you ever been doing something and God just put something in your head, or gives you a verse, or sends somebody into your life to pray with you or to speak a word of encouragement? That's revealed knowledge. Indigenous people have that too. And that's the part that some people feel, that doesn't, you know, I just don't know how I feel about that. Is that from God? Absolutely. God can speak to any one of us, anywhere, anytime. And this is an example. So my father, who is now a Baptist preacher, but in his previous life has been a little bit of everything. He's dropped out of school after grade 8, and he went to work at age 13, and he was a man who learned from doing. He had many jobs. He ended up being a general manager at a gypsum board plant for 30 years. And when he retired, God called him to be a lay Baptist preacher at Bethany Baptist Church on Six Nations. And I like to tell people, particularly at the university, that my father is the smartest man I know. Number one, because he uses his Indigenous knowledge, and number two, because he relies on God for everything. And this is an example that I use. So when I was about 8 years old, I was outside with my father, and it was a nice sunny, warm summer day, and we had just this brief rain shower. It was just like it just came out of nowhere. It lasted a few minutes and off it went, and then it was sunny again. And my dad told me to look at the fence that we were standing beside. And he said, just look at it. So I'm standing there looking at it. And I noticed that these raindrops are hanging from the fence, and they're not dropping. They're just not dropping. So that was the only thing I noticed. So I said to my dad, well, this is what I noticed. And he said, okay. He said, remember that. He said, the next time you see that, you'll know that even though it looks sunny out, it's going to rain again. And lo and behold, about an hour later, there was another little burst of rain. And I thought in my mind, you know, this is my dad. He told me it's the truth. I don't have to worry about this. Well, fast forward, I'm 28 years old. I'm in a university physics course, and we're talking about the surface tension of water and how atmospheric pressure would change how a raindrop would drop. And all of that could be indicative of further precipitation along the way. And it blew my mind, because something my dad had told me in a very simple story 20 years prior, from a man with a grade 8 education, it was being explained to me in physics class. And that's how I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt my people had knowledge, because it's not that we don't know things. We may not explain it in a scientific method or in a Western way of thinking, but we know these things. We just know them. So how changed? What happened to all of that knowledge that my people had? Well, the change actually happened a long time ago in the 1400s through a series of papal bulls. So the rich people of Europe decided that, you know, we need more land, we need more territory, and we need to be able to, when we get there, to ensure that we can take possession of it. And they went to the Pope at the time, and he issued a series of papal bulls that basically said that if you arrive to one of these lands and the people are not Christians, then they're not humans like the rest of us, and the land does not belong to them. And that will be the justification for colonization. That's a very simplified form of it, but that's what happened. And the ideology of the fact that this land was empty and was owned by nobody is the basis of the formation of the governments of Canada and the United States. And it allowed all of the horrors that we know happened to Indigenous people. And so the root of the problem went all the way back to the 1400s. My people had no idea that all of this was happening. And most of your people didn't either. But it happened. And that set in motion 600 years of what we now know today as colonization. Here's an example of why I know we weren't savages. So Jacques Cartier, which most of us know about his exploration of Canada, on his second trip, he came to Quebec City, or what was known as Strathcona at the time. Strathcona is the Indigenous name for the place that is now Quebec City. And my people were there. And he came actually too late in the season, and he got ice locked. His ship was ice locked. And he noticed that not only the crew of the ship, but also the Haudenosaunee people there were coming down with what we now know as scurvy. But then all of a sudden, the Haudenosaunee people were getting better. And he was looking and he was thinking, how is this happening? So he went and talked to the Haudenosaunee people and he said, how come your people are getting better? And they said, oh, well, we're drinking this tea. It's our medicine. And he thought, okay, can I have some for my people? And he took it back to the ship. But there's some people who were afraid of our medicine, who thought maybe it was witchcraft or there was something wrong with it, and they wouldn't take it. The people who drank the medicine got better. The people who didn't drink the medicine didn't get better. And the people on the ship who got better were amazed. They were like, even our physicians in Europe couldn't do this. It was simply that there was vitamin C and the pine needles that were in the tea, and that replaced what they needed and helped them recover from scurvy. So my people had this knowledge. We knew how to fix some diseases. So our first contact with newcomers wasn't all ugly. It wasn't all horrible. We were curious about each other. We were a little bit nervous. I'm sure your ancestors were nervous. My ancestors were nervous, but we were curious. And for my people, it was for the first time that we had ever seen people that weren't the same color as us. It was amazing when you hear the oral history stories and the pale faces. My people were amazed. They had never seen people like this before. And we slowly started to learn how to work with each other. There were some intermarriages. There was definitely some business deals going on, but it wasn't all ugly. We started to work with each other, but then we sort of took a wrong turn. And if we think about where did we take a wrong turn in Canada, it was really about beaver fur. So in the 1500s, when the French were trying to take control of territory and the British were still trying to take control of territory, everybody in Europe wanted some beaver fur because it's beautiful and it's warm. And so beaver fur became this huge commodity. And what happened was the French got some people on their side, some Indigenous people on their side, and the British got some Indigenous people on their side. And then we started fighting with each other. So things started to fall apart, and but it wasn't really about race. It was about money and a little bit about greed. And I mean, all of us who go to church know that money and greed often is the root of most evil. So my people in particular made relationships with the Dutch, because the Dutch were some of the first people to encounter my people. So our first agreement, the Two-Row Wampum Agreement, was with the Dutch. And, our leaders talked back and forth, the Dutch leaders and our leaders back and forth and back and forth. And finally, we came up with the Two-Row Wampum. And what it represents is a river. And if you can imagine that the white beads in the wampum are the waters with which our relationship will be conducted. And the original waters were peace, respect, and peace, power, and righteousness. It's now interpreted as peace, respect, and friendship. But basically it meant that is the mind that all people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, should have when we're coming into relationship with each other. One purple band represents the newcomer's ship with all of their knowledge and their tools and everything that they have that God has given them to thrive. That's in the ship there. And the other purple band represents a canoe with my people in it and all the things that God has given us to survive. And we will go down the river of life together. We will have peace between each other because we're going to respect each other and we're going to have our friendship together. And we're never going to try and jump into each other's boats and take over. We're going to go together as brothers, and we can help each other and we can respect each other all along the way. So that was our original intention, our agreement with our first encounters with newcomers, the Dutch. And as I said, our Confederacy was quite complex. And in fact, the United States has based their Constitution on a lot of the principles that governed my people, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And this has actually been acknowledged by the United States Senate. So there was a complexity of knowledge and social and health systems that existed in the Americas prior to contact with newcomers. What happened to us besides the fact that those papal bulls were issued? Well, we couldn't cure all diseases that we had never been exposed to. So if you think about COVID and what isolation was, because we were keeping people away from each other so that we didn't share our bugs. Well, this pre-colonization was a big isolation experiment because every continent sort of had their own bugs. And the people living in the continent had learned how to live with those bugs. But then we started to cross continents. Globalization had started, and we started sharing bugs. But for my people, it was devastating. We don't have numbers of how many people lived in this country prior to colonization, but we estimate that there were millions. And we got wiped out by a bunch of new diseases that we had never seen before. And then with the progression of colonization, the change in our lifestyles, starvation and malnutrition contributed to the loss of life from these diseases. And as I said, the ideology of the papal bulls underlined policymaking. Now, the first policy in Canada around Indigenous people was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And at that time, the British Crown recognized that there was a possibility that Indigenous people and their lands and resources could be exploited. And so the original proclamation was really to say the British Crown will work with Indigenous people around these issues. But as Canada started to move to become their own country, they pulled away from that original Royal Proclamation, and they started to make policies that were more and more in line with assimilation and with sort of removing the Indigenous problem by either assimilating Indigenous people in or introducing things such as residential schools and Indian hospitals that contributed to loss of life, with the ideal goal being that Indigenous people would no longer be an issue moving forward. The Indian Act still continues today. It is the only piece of legislation in Canada that governs a race of people. Under the Indian Act, I am still identified as a status Indian. And as a child, I didn't realize that I wasn't an Indian. It was common vernacular. It was what we were identified as. And when I started to come to McMaster University, I was sitting in a group, and it was a multicultural group, and we were talking about who we were, and I referred to myself as an Indian. Well, the lady sitting next to me was actually from India. And she looked at me and she goes, "You're not an Indian." And it was the first time that I questioned it for myself. And I thought, you're right, I'm not an Indian. That's not who my people say we are. It's just what the federal government has said we are. But today in Canada, we're still legally known as Indians. The original Indian Act governed everything about us: our lands, our property, how we acted, how we dressed, what we practiced spiritually, where we could live, everything about us. 50 years of amendments were even more restrictive, and it really wasn't until mid-19th century, mid-20th century, that the restrictions started to pull back. And right now, the current state of the Indian Act, in fact, is that we don't know what to do with it, because the Indian Act is so entrenched in policy and every law and every system that if we just said today, no more Indian Act, it would still not address the inequity in the systems. So it is a very contentious issue. It's not something that will be solved in my lifetime, but every generation of my people and your people that go forward and critically examine it leads to a better change. So who am I if I'm not an Indian? Because the Indian Act has said I'm an Indian since 1876. When the Canadian Constitution was reopened in 1982, our status as people was at that time reaffirmed. So I was born in 1975. So that means that I was 7 years old before I was considered a person with all equal rights as any other person in Canada. That all happened in my lifetime. And at that time, Indians were then labeled as Aboriginal and further classified as Inuit, Métis, and First Nations. And then in 2004, our country, Canada, adopted Indigenous as a way to describe who we are. Residential schools, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because there's a great deal of information out there for anyone who's interested in learning more, but it was created to eliminate Indigenous knowledge. The first official residential school actually opened in Brantford, which is 20-30 minutes from most of where we all live, and 1831. And the last residential school in Canada did not close until 1996. And if you have done any, reading of the newspapers, you'll understand that there was this other system called day school. And so I was a day school child, and I didn't know it. So when residential school was no longer mandatory, schools were created on reserves, and I live on Six Nations Reserve. And I thought it was a normal day school or a normal elementary school like everyone else. It wasn't until I grew up that I realized it wasn't. That, watching my brother get beaten for mispronouncing words was not something that was happening off reserve. For having the teacher slap me upside the head for disagreeing with another little girl was not something that was happening off reserve. I can remember, we all had a fear of the dentist because every once in a while this car would pick you up from school and without your parents' permission or knowledge, and it would take you to a dentist. And if you were lucky, the dentist would use freezing when they did their work. But if you weren't lucky and the dentist didn't believe you needed freezing, you didn't get any freezing. And you might be 7 years old sitting in a dentist chair by yourself getting dental work without freezing. I didn't realize any of that was not normal. So the schooling system really didn't change for us until 1996. And this quote I put up because people often wonder why there has been such a kerfuffle in the world about statues and venerating Canadian leaders. And really it's because Indigenous people see those leaders from a whole different perspective. When Indigenous people think of Sir John A. Macdonald, this is the quote that they think of. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It's been strong pressed on myself as the head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes and thoughts of white men. So It's a matter of perspective. When you read these things in the newspaper, when you hear these stories and you see these protests, it's because the Indigenous perspective is completely different than the Canadian perspective. And that's because our experience over the last 300, 400, 500 years has been completely different than other Canadians. And when, even in our health systems, in our research systems, our country is, part of the advanced nations that uses data and technology. And yet those things have hurt my people. The vaccines, the BCG vaccine for tuberculosis, those experiments happened on Indigenous children. And during those experiments, it was recorded that these children were malnourished, that the social conditions in which they were now living in, which was so different than their natural lives, was contributing to their poor health. And yet the research continued and the experiment continued without any intervention for the malnutrition that these children were experimenting. Residential schools was a perfect place for people to try out things. There are stories of our own military coming to the residential schools and trying out rations on children. And if the children could survive on the rations, then that meant soldiers could survive on the rations. And the harmful part of all of this is that leadership knew, doctors knew, researchers knew, politicians knew. They knew the story. They didn't tell your grandparents, and they didn't tell my grandparents, and they didn't do anything about it. They just kept it quiet. We were still not seen as people. We'll take tuberculosis as an example. When I went to medical school, and even today when I go to medical conferences, inevitably on every slide, it'll say that being an Indigenous person makes you high risk for having tuberculosis. That, in many healthcare professionals' minds, says that we have a genetic risk for tuberculosis, but that's not true. If you look at a map of where tuberculosis is in Canada right now, it's in mainly northern communities where housing and air quality is a problem. So it's a social condition, not a genetic condition. And, Hamilton had a tuberculosis sanatorium. And when I started to look into tuberculosis and the Indigenous story along with it, I found this quote, and it made it sound like the sanatorium was a great place where you could just go and convalesce. And then I had the privilege of caring for an Indigenous man who had spent many, many days at the sanatorium, was not allowed to see his parents, was not allowed to be who he was as an Indigenous person. So the story that generally is known amongst Canadians about what it was like to convalesce in the sanatorium is not the Indigenous perspective at all. And where we can start to see some evidence is with the Inuit people. This is a picture that was taken in the Hamilton Sanatorium. And what it's meant to depict is like a good convalescence experience for these people who are brought from the remote north down to have TB treatment. But that's not the story that the Inuit people tell us. They tell us that their children were sent hundreds of miles away from their families, sometimes without their families ever knowing. And sometimes if they were children and they recovered from TB, they didn't get to go back home. They just were sent from a sanatorium to a residential school. And some of the children and some of the people died, and those families still do not know where those people are buried today. So the story has to have all perspectives, or we're just getting one side and it isn't the full history. So this is from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it was also in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples from the 90s. For over a century, the central goals of Canada's Aboriginal policy were to eliminate Aboriginal governments, ignore Aboriginal rights, terminate the treaties, and through a process of assimilation, cause Aboriginal peoples to cease to exist as distinct legal, social, cultural, religious, and racial entities in Canada. But the good news story is we're still here, because I'm here talking to you today. So something kept us here. I believe God had a plan. As bad as all those things were that my people went through, God had a plan. God was watching out for us all this time. And he said, no, these Indigenous people, they need to stay, and I will make a way for them to survive. But we didn't survive without trauma. So, I had a cousin who grew up in Prince George, British Columbia. And it wasn't until she was about 35 years old that she was told she was an Indigenous person. And it broke her heart. She had always been raised to believe that she was not Indigenous. And she had been raised to not have anything to do with Indigenous people because they were poor and they were drunks and they were not worthy. And that story came to me when I was just starting school. And I've spent 20 years pondering this story. And really what it is, that was also a response to trauma. My people responded to trauma in many different ways. One was substance abuse, because they didn't know how to break through and to come through all of this. And so you take away children from their families. What does that mean? That means that children grow up without love. They grow up without hugs. They grow up without learning how to cook from their mom. They grow up without learning how to care for themselves, because that's what their parents would teach them. So we have a generation of children that were taken from their communities, taken from their families. So they lost the ability to parent. And then you have a perpetual cycle of abuse because they don't know how to love and they don't know how to parent. But not everybody did, but it did happen. In my own family, I think about what was the trauma, and really for parts of my family, it was denying who we were as Indigenous people, because some people in my family didn't look visibly Indigenous, and they could deny who they were publicly. And for other parts of my family, it was anger and it was substance abuse. And all of these pieces of trauma play out every day, even in my own family. So I'm going to use an example of where my knowledge as an Indigenous person, Indigenous ways of knowing, can correct wrongs. So if we look at gender inequality in our society, or any of the issues around gender, it wasn't that big of a deal in my community. By the time European newcomers came to this community, in my community, Indigenous women were leaders. We weren't the chiefs, but we picked the chiefs. We weren't the only head of the family, but we owned the home. We were leaders. We were on par with our men. We all had roles. We weren't seen as less than. But when European men came here, we were shocking to them. Because if you imagine at the time when European people came here, the role of women in European society was very different than an Haudenosaunee woman. Women were homemakers. Oftentimes the men were the ones who did all the business. Women didn't vote. Women didn't lead churches. Women didn't do these types of roles. And so it was a complete cognitive dissonance for European men to see these women doing these things. And they couldn't understand how it was that we owned land and we were powerful and we had powerful roles in our own community. And so from a non-Indigenous perspective, they had to build a framework around what women were to understand us. And really, it wasn't a good thing. It built a framework of sexual deviance, of changing, using religion in a way. Many of the churches that were first established used religion in a way to say that our women were being sinful, that we were evil, that we must be sexually deviant if we would act in this way. There's a story, and it's a story that breaks my heart. There's a story, there's a medicine for women, and it's a specific berry that grows close to the ground. And one day, Indigenous women were out collecting this berry, and they were on their hands and knees, and European men seen them. And the women, in their perspective, they were doing their role. They were collecting medicine. It was a beautiful time for them. But in the European perspective, it was taken as being a sexually deviant thing that these women were doing, in the way that they were crawling across the land. And the outcome of this clash of perspective was rape and humiliation of the Indigenous woman. But it was a clash of perspectives. And it was a way in which Christianity was starting to be weaponized against my people. And what was the outcome of that? Missing and murdered Indigenous women. Stories like Joyce Echaquan. Because we were marginalized, our roles were mischaracterized, and because we were seen as being sexually deviant, because we weren't demure, because we didn't dress in the way that European women dressed, then our sexuality had to be policed. And some of this was codified actually in the Indian Act. It still is today. There was a time in this country where a non-Indigenous woman could marry an Indigenous man and gain all the benefits of an Indigenous woman under the federal government. And yet, if an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man, she was then stripped of her Indigenous personhood by the federal government. And we still have a huge issue with missing and murdered Indigenous women in this country today. Now, it hasn't always been a bad news story. There has been good things happening along the way. As I said, Canadian reaffirmed us as human people in 1982, but it wasn't until 2011 that I myself, as an Indigenous person, could file a complaint under the Human Rights Act. I was not allowed to until 2011. Imagine that, 12 years ago in this country. So what does 2023 look like? So I pulled these news headlines from this year. Manitoulin student death in foster care, Indigenous. 3 Indigenous deaths, Vancouver police. Body of an Indigenous woman found in a Winnipeg landfill. What is the value of Indigenous people in this country today? And that's a question we all need to ask. It should be the same value as every other person in this country, newcomer, European descent, Indigenous. Our lives all have equal value. So what is reconciliation? This is a roadmap to reconciliation proposed by Indigenous leadership. We have to renew our nation-to-nation relationship. And tonight, MacNeill Baptist Church did that when they did their land acknowledgement. That is a renewal of a nation-to-nation relationship. MacNeill Baptist Church also did it by allowing this conversation, a critical conversation about Canada. And together we're talking about closing the gap and improving life conditions for Indigenous people. And doing all of this, we are restoring our relationship and improving the relationship. And if we continue to do this together and to critically think together, I like the word Selah in the Bible because it means stop and think about it. Just stop and think about it. If I could insert a Bible word right here, I'd insert Selah. Stop and think about it. And it was so important, and many of you probably read the newspapers. It was so important that the Pope addressed the doctrine of discovery, because that created terra nullius. In the 1400s, we are doing root cause analysis, and we're addressing those root causes together in 2023. What is self-determination for Indigenous people? People will say, well, what is it that you people want? We want the same thing we always wanted. I'm going to read you this statement, and this is from the Chiefs of Ontario. It's not adversarial. It's not meant to be warlike. We have said this from time immemorial. We are the Anishinaabeg, the Mushkegowuk, Angwahoe, and the Lenape peoples, sovereign nations of Turtle Island. We have jurisdiction to administer and operate our own political, legal, economic, social, and cultural systems. And as sovereign nations, we've never surrendered those rights or our title to the Crown or to Canada. It's not adversarial. It's just simply who we are. And what can we do? What can we do to change our perspectives? Because I need every day to start to learn other people's perspectives, because that's how I interact and build relationships. So what can you do to start to understand an Indigenous perspective and interact and build relationships? Well, we have to shift from a deficit narrative to a strength narrative. And I like to call it the poor sick Indians. The Indians have more cancer, they smoke more, they're sicker, they're poorer, they're this, they're that. No more, no more. Let's decide together tonight that we're not going to use that narrative anymore. We're going to talk about strong, resilient people, which include Europeans, newcomers, immigrants, Indigenous, every single person that is residing in this country. And the reason why we have to get away from deficit-based approaches to thinking about people is because it leads to stigmatization, it leads to stereotypes, and we get in this negative feedback loop that we can never get out of. But if we start to say, hey, what's the root cause? How can we address this together? Let's build on our strengths as Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. Let's just move forward together. We're changing the narrative together. And this slide is, I like this slide. This is not by Indigenous people. This is by a community program in the US. But I love it when we talk about at-risk youth. That's a deficit. We're not at risk. Where's the potential in our people? We talk about problems, the sicker, the cancer rates, the this, the that. Let's talk about Indigenous medicine. What was in Annetta? What can we get? What can we learn from that type of medicine, why we can get vitamin C in a natural way? You know, there are strengths. There are different. Change the narrative. Change the narrative for yourself, for the people around you, for your community, and it will change the narrative in this country. And we can do that using a simple Mi'kmaq concept called two-eyed seeing. It's available on the internet. You can just type in two-eyed seeing and you'll find these resources. And it's a Mi'kmaq way of looking at the world. And it says that take your Western knowledge and education and all the great and good that we've got from modern society and recognize that Indigenous knowledge. And when you put them together, you no longer have monocular vision that leaves you with blind spots. You actually have binocular vision that lets you see all of the world around you. And this is a pictorial depiction of that. So, you know, oftentimes it feels so adversarial, like it's Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but we just need to learn to see through each other's eyes. We're not adversaries. We're walking alongside each other all the time. We're in the river of life together. We just need to remember how to see each other in an appropriate way. So my people see the world in a different way. And there's beauty and there's knowledge in that. And your people see the world in a different way. And there's beauty and knowledge in that. Let's bring it together. And again, that's why it's important that you know who you are, where you come from, where your knowledge comes from, because you need to know yourself before you can start to understand other perspectives as well. And if we think about what worldviews are, they're informed. Today we think about society and it's so fast paced and it's TikTok and it's Facebook and it's all of these other things. That's just the surface of today's culture, because underneath of that, there's so much more. We know that. We know that the world isn't, that everybody in the world isn't a Kardashian. We all know that. But if we were just outside looking in, we might think that everybody's like a Kardashian, because that's what's spread across our media. That's what's in our newspapers, on our billboards. But there's so much more to being a Canadian. Canada as a country is a baby. If you think about it, we're only a little more than 150 years old. You know, we can't even begin to compare to some place like Ethiopia that's thousands of years old. So we really need to continue to critically think about who we are as Canadians. What does that mean? What is our deep culture? Not just our surface culture, Tim Hortons and hockey. What are the deeper things? What are the things that make us Canadian? And what makes me a person, a Canadian, a Christian, whatever you identify as? What is it? What is the deeper things? When we turn off our technology and we find a quiet place and we observe nature and land around us and our soul's quiet, that's when we can start to find out who we are. You have to sit with it. You have to think about it. You have to roll it around in your head. So where are we in terms of Christianity and Indigenous people? Because this is a little dicey subject. I know, because I'm a Christian Indigenous person, and it's always playing cognitive dissonance in my head. Well, we know Christianity has been blamed for a lot of the boarding schools, residential schools. Now, if you look at Canadian history, I can tell you with certainty the Baptist Church in general was never involved in residential schools. But what I can tell you with certainty as well is that most Indigenous people don't know that. Most Indigenous people do not know the difference between Catholic, Presbyterian, any of the Christian faiths. Church is church. And so unfortunately, even Baptist churches have to bear the brunt of what's happened because of Catholic school policies, Anglican policies, United Church policies within these residential schools. And that's something that we as modern day Christians have to be aware of, that Indigenous people don't know the difference. And so we have a black eye that we didn't create, but we have to address and we have to live with. And as much as I am not a Catholic person, I am thankful that there is all this attention on the doctrine of discovery, and there is movement within the Catholic Church to address that doctrine, because that is really, truly reconciliation. When you're willing to go back to the 1400s and say, yes, we made a mistake and we shouldn't have done this. That's humility. That's truth and reconciliation in action. So I'm going to leave us with a couple of final thoughts. We are not that different. And the reason why I think that is because this is the covenant chain, and it goes along with the two-row wampum. You can't have the two-row wampum if you don't have the covenant chain. It was another agreement with the Dutch. And these are just some quotes, but basically the covenant chain was another wampum agreement that was made with the Dutch. And you'll see that there are two people on this wampum, and there's a chain holding them together. And the idea really came from the ships that the Dutch had come to this country on. They had big silver coated chains on them. And my people looked at those chains and they realized that silver is pretty sturdy. You can use it for a lot of things, and it doesn't rust or disintegrate with time, but it does get tarnished. And so just like silver, if we're going to be in friendship, if we're going to have peace between each other, we have to revisit over and over and over again how we are maintaining our relationship. What is happening? Are we coming to it with good minds? Are we coming to it in the spirit of friendship and peace? Are we living our lives, conducting our work, our business, our education, everything that we do in the spirit of peace and friendship? We have to keep coming back to that. And so when I think about those teachings from an Indigenous perspective, I always, because I'm a Christian Indigenous person, think about, well, how does this go with the Bible? This is a copy of the address, and it doesn't marry along with the biblical words of the Bible. But what it does, these are supposed to be the words that come before all else. So as an Indigenous person, I'm supposed to think about these things every morning. As a Christian person, I'm supposed to start my day off with God. I can do both of these things together because really I'm thanking God for everything he's done for me. If I'm using the Thanksgiving address, putting myself in a good mind, that's my Haudenosaunee teachings. And I can do it as a Christian because I spend my morning with God, giving thanks and asking him to help me be the person that I'm supposed to be. So we have common ground and we have divine instructions. Matthew 5:9 talks about peace. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Matthew 5:47, if you salute your brethren only, what do ye more than others? Do not even the publicans do so? So if I, as an Indigenous person, only care about Indigenous people, then I'm not doing my job that God has given me to do. I'm not better than just any ordinary average person. As a Christian, I'm supposed to care about you. I'm supposed to care about every nation in this entire planet. Romans 12:18, if it be possible, as much lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. The covenant chain of peace, the true wampum, pathways to peace. Hebrews 12:14, follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord. We're supposed to live in peace with each other because we all want the same thing. We all want to live together in peace, and we all want to go to see our Creator once we leave this earth. We are all told to have a good mind, even in the Bible, Acts 10:34 and 35. Then Peter opened his mouth and said, of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him. God doesn't see race. God doesn't see the color of our skins. He sees us all as human beings, and that's how we're supposed to be. 1 Peter 3:8, finally, be ye all of one mind, having compassion one of another, love his brethren, be pitiful, be courteous. Always. I always tell people, if we would all just follow the good golden rule, imagine the world we'd live in. Do unto others as you'd have done unto you. Imagine if every day, every person committed to that, what our world would be like. And finally, Thanksgiving, 1 Thessalonians 5:18, and everything give thanks, the Thanksgiving address, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you. So I hope today I've given you a little bit of an understanding why the history is important, that we need to build relationships with each other. We need to talk, we need to share the truth, and we need to come together, because that's how reconciliation will happen. It won't happen with me in my little corner being suspicious of you and not talking to you. And it won't happen if you feel that way about me. So let's come together. Now, I've shared my thoughts. I've shared my heart with you today, and I am now in relationship with you. And I thank you for this opportunity.
Heather, you're on mute.
So a very little time to ask questions after that amazing talk. I'm wondering, Bev, if there are any questions that came by the chat room. No,
No.
We're not big techies here around this table, I think. So there is a chance to ask and interact with Amy before we end, but please just indicate if you'd like to ask a question.
So Amy, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm not actually from MacNeill Baptist. I found out about this through a gentleman in my church, and I'm not sure what his connection with MacNeill Baptist is, but I'm very grateful to have been able to join you all this evening, and hopefully I'll be able to find my way out to Hamilton from East York over the follow-up sessions. But just really appreciated you sharing, and I think it was really good to have some deeper layers in that rooting within your own understanding and identity, because I think I've heard about these things in very general terms versus those very specific identities of your people as the Haudenosaunee. So thank you for sharing that. I just wanted to go back to the Tura Wampum. I managed to write down what the old white lines were supposed to represent, but I didn't quite catch what the new things were.
So,
I know
the modern interpretation of the white wampum would be the rivers of peace, respect, and friendship.
respect and friendship. Okay, thank you very much.
Absolutely. And I don't want anybody to feel bad if you don't have a question yet. I do this talk all the time, and usually 2 weeks later, that's when the emails come, because people have been sitting with it. They've been thinking about it and rolling it around in their head.
I did. Oh, sorry. It was just somebody.
Monica, and then Garth.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Tracy. Sorry.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much. Those of you who know me know I'm from out west, and I got to grow up among the Métis, and it's a whole different history and a whole different, but it's the same history still. It's just a different way of looking at it. So I didn't really have a good knowledge of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe here in Ontario. So that was really helpful to me. A lot of the same problems throughout the country. And I really appreciate, it's making me think about a lot of things. And I guess what I want to know is, moving forward now, how do we do, maybe we need to create a new wampum belt about how we want to move forward that I think should include language. They're talking about in Canada trying to bring in more immigrants who speak French, and I'm thinking, is French the language of this country? Is English the language of this country? No. Should we be learning Cree or Ojibwe or the language from around here? So anyway, all of that is happening in my brain, and thank you, because I think it was always there, and now I'm thinking I'm going to have to say this out loud more, and that we shouldn't fear what I think people consider witchcraft, which is female empowerment.
Yes.
That's all I have to say for now.
I think Garth did you have a question?
Yes, I do have equal thanks. I've got been privileged, I think, to get to know some friends, because I live and work within the field of social assistance in this area, and Brantford has been a home for an office home for me for a number of years, and got to work with folks at both Credit and Six Nations, and it's a privilege. I've had the opportunity as well to spend some time at the residential school in Brantford, and will encourage folks who, if you haven't, please do go and visit that. It's impactful as a site if you haven't done that yet. And it doesn't actually hurt to go a few times, to be honest, because I've done that as well. So I do want to ask, how comfortable are you in sharing the slides?
Oh, I'm very comfortable. I can put it in a PDF form, and I'll send it off to the organizers, and then they can share with whoever would like.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've recorded the session tonight, but I have to say that there were a few really good informative pieces that, I mean, yeah, I will say this to you, Amy. I don't think I've actually heard the history from the 1400s in a succinct and clear way that you've provided tonight. Like that, I gotta say, that was amazing. So, wow. Anyway, that's, so thank you. Just that's also all I can say is express my thanks.
Absolutely. I didn't know I was going to be a historian too, but God works in mysterious ways.
I think, Gary, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, you can unmute.
Yeah, I think Europeans have forgotten their roots. When the Romans took over Europe, we were the indigenous. But we've treated indigenous far worse than the Romans ever did.
That's such a great observation. I didn't realize that until I started working with a woman from Wales. And the first time I met her, I said she was British, and whoa, did I get a tongue lashing in a story. And then I opened my eyes and I learned that it wasn't just brown-skinned people that were colonized in the history of nations. All nations at some point have had to face colonization in some form.
Yeah. It's hard to deal with the things. I read Red Power by Cardinal in the 60s, and for a week afterwards, I perfected the hate stare, and there were a lot of innocent white people who got it. I was just absolutely livid, which is easier to do if you're a white, pink guy. But it's hard to try and treat that kind of behavior, to get equanimity with that kind of behavior.
I'll tell you what my dad told me. It's okay to have righteous anger. Be angry and sin not.
Yeah.
So I'm conscious of the time, and I just wanted to ask Lynn to end our session for us.
Oh, wait a minute.
You're on mute.
Can you unmute yourself, Lynn?
There I
There you go.
succeeded.
Yeah.
Amy, you certainly have given us many things to consider and to think about and ponder on. And on behalf of all of us here, I want to sincerely thank you for that. You certainly opened our eyes and our minds to a lot of things tonight. And as you said, it is probably going to take us a long time to go over it and to really understand all that you've said to us tonight. But we do thank you. And it's even great that you're a Baptist. A good one.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yes.
Well, thank you again. I have so enjoyed this. And, I just know that everything is possible in Christ. And so we're going to get there one day. And sometimes we just have to be okay with being the seed planters, knowing that God will bring the increase.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye-bye. See
Good
you.
night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.